Welcome to our Brussels studio here for TVP World. My name is Laura Hazanov and I'm joined by Marta Welander, the EU Advocacy Director at the International Rescue Committee. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Now, we're here on the day the EU Migration and Asylum Pact comes into force. Officials here in Brussels have long been arguing that this is the result of a decade-long effort to restore order to the asylum system, obviously after the 2015 crisis that we faced here after the war in Syria. They're insisting that this system does intend to make this migration pact work better, to make it easier rather than restrict the right to asylum itself. Now, do you believe that EU officials are fundamentally misrepresenting something here, or at least underestimating the real-world consequences that this legislation could have for very real people who are coming into the EU looking for a better life?
Great. Yeah, thank you for that question. Indeed, as an organization that works to support people and communities in displacement across the entire arc of displacement around the world and in Europe, we are very concerned about the commencement of the implementation of the pact today. We see that member states are not necessarily ready, that the required safeguards have not always been put into place. There's a lack of human rights monitoring mechanisms to be accompanying the accelerated border procedures. And so there's a real risk for people with vulnerabilities and even for children that they will fall through the cracks on some of these fast-track procedures, and that there aren't enough safeguards to keep them safe. We also see that there's limited, in many member states, there's going to be limited access to legal assistance in the fast-track procedures. And so overall, we do have concerns about how this pact will actually affect the people that it concerns. We do understand the need for an orderly and predictable and humane asylum system, but we feel that we're not ready and that this pact can come with great challenges and risks.
Right, and as you rightfully said, there is a really deep divide here. Obviously, the right wing is saying that they're upset with this system. They're saying that there are not enough safeguards and that we actually should be using much stronger language and much stronger legislation in regards to our migration system, while others, like yourself, are saying that we may be headed for a humanitarian disaster here. Is there any middle ground between these two sides?
I think it's possible to have a system that upholds the rights and safety of people seeking safety, but I don't think that the current system is set up for that. I think it is feasible to invest in the right parts of the system if we invest in reception conditions, legal assistance, integration and inclusion measures. We'd be setting ourselves up for a much better situation. But instead we see a strong focus on deterrence, externalization, and now also deportations, and huge amounts of public funding are being allocated to this. It's a million-dollar question, though, what the system should look like. What we focus on as a humanitarian organization is, of course, to advocate for the rights and safety of the people that we support.
And as you mentioned, obviously, deportation centers, home raids, longer detention periods, this is language that would not have been used in the EU 10 years ago. So what has changed in our society that this is now becoming a new normal?
I mean, there's of course different perspectives on that and different answers that different people will give. I think it's safe to say that migration has for a long time been a politicized issue utilized by parties and politicians in order to gain voters and in order to strengthen their position. So I think people seeking safety are used as pawns in a political game. Media attention to certain issues in migration also contributes to this perceived threat and this hysteria around migration, and certain elements of migration and asylum are emphasized that creates fear in society, quite frankly, instead of lifting out and focusing on the positive aspects of migration and the contributions to many societies that newcomers actually bring. So indeed, a highly politicized and securitized issue, unfortunately, instead of focusing on constructive solutions.
And I was going to ask whether, do you feel like migration is more of an opportunity for the European continent and for the EU, which is currently facing more and more stagnation all across the board economically? Are there things that we're missing here, rather than these security issues, which you maybe are suggesting may have been overblown or used for political gain in many cases?
There's a lot of different pieces of research that looks at the financial contributions of newcomers. We also see positive contributions to communities when we have a blending of cultures, and so it depends on how one looks at it. We, as a humanitarian organization, see a lot of positive contributions of the people that we serve who successfully integrate and become included in their new host societies in Europe. So there's certainly a much more positive and human side to this if one looks at the reality. But of course there's different viewpoints on this, and I'm not going to be able to convince anybody who's on the other side of the spectrum.
Right, but there are some concrete figures that we have to face here. Now, the European Commission has given us a result of 29%. This is the amount of individuals whose applications have been rejected that actually end up leaving the bloc. Now, some of these people, their applications are rejected on very real concerns of them becoming possibly terrorists or in any way security liabilities for people living here. How do you feel that you should deal with this?
There's certainly a place for returns and a logic for returns within the contemporary international asylum system. But the way that the current return regulation that has now been agreed very recently between the EU institutions, and that will be voted next Wednesday in Parliament, this return regulation, what it does is that it really significantly ramps up member states' deportation powers without putting in place the required safeguards and protections that would allow for a system that is lawful and morally defensible, quite frankly. So this is a piece of legislation that has really been rushed through extremely fast, and that has been referred to, I believe, by Home Commissioner Brunner as the missing piece of the pact. But what this does is putting people at heightened risks, and it's really lacking of the required safeguards and protections. So this is not the solution. There needs to be a way forward, but it has been rushed through and in a way that it does not uphold legal standards and human rights protections.
So as you said, you believe that this has been rushed through, but we've actually already seen a similar system implemented. The UK government already had a similar system in place where failed asylum seekers were deported to Rwanda. Now, the previous Conservative government had spent close to 800 million euros on a program that was, of course, ultimately scrapped and by many deemed a complete failure. Do you feel like we could be headed for a similar scenario here?
I fear so, indeed, because under this return regulation we have Article 17, which allows EU member states to set up so-called return hubs, which is very similar to this UK-Rwanda deal. And these would essentially be offshore detention facilities in non-EU countries where people would be held for certain amounts of time. They risk being legal black holes, really, where it's unclear who would be accountable for the protection and well-being of those held in the centres, and there would be no clear monitoring mechanism. So EU policymakers would have, first of all, no way of assuring that people's rights and safety are upheld. As you also mentioned, it's extremely costly. So we have seen also the Italy-Albania centres that were extremely complicated and legally challenged. They had to close for some period of time, and we've seen that they are just very costly and counterproductive. So indeed, with these return hubs, we really risk heading in a similar direction.
Now, obviously, all considerations are valid here. However, what we are seeing concretely is a surge of far-right party politics all across Europe. Now, there is a clear anxiety among EU citizens about migration, and I feel like we can establish that for many it is valid. We have to validate those feelings, because otherwise we risk those parties gaining more and more support. So, do you feel like there's any way of easing that anxiety other than the legislation that we're currently talking about? Is there another way out of this?
I think that links back to what we discussed earlier about how certain narratives around migration are lifted out and highlighted more than others. So we see consistently in the political discourse and in the media discourse, we see the threats, the criminalization language, highlighting, a very small minority of asylum seekers who have committed crimes. They are being highlighted, and this is quite frankly spreading, understandably, a lot of fear. So by instead highlighting positive stories of integration and contributions that we also discussed earlier, I think there could be a way to ease the societal anxiety around migration on the one hand, but then of course also looking at a system that is orderly but also humane, and not rushing through pieces of legislation like the return regulation, which is not adequate and which really risks leading to immigration raids across Europe, people being torn up, uprooted from their communities where they might have lived for years now and started their new lives here in the EU, and also tearing families apart. So I think it's not an either-or question. It's a question of how do we, on the one hand, ease the societal anxiety by stopping to spread fear-mongering around migration, and on the other hand, elaborating a system that does both, both upholds rights and safety, and also creates more order in the system.
Marta, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned to TVP World for more news and updates. My name is Laura Hazanov here in Brussels.